Senhoras e senhores,
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the annual conference of the Central Bank of Brazil for 2024, a gathering of academics, private sector experts, and representatives of the central banks and multilateral institutions. The conference has the aim of debating various topics in the areas of macroeconomics, financial stability, banking economics, among others. The 2024 edition will feature 2 days of keynote speeches and academic debates, as well as a morning dedicated to celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Real Plan. The full event schedule can be found on the Central Bank of Brazil's website or consulted using the QR code available on the event name tags. The opening sessions and keynote speeches will be broadcast live on the Central Bank's YouTube channel, while the academic sessions will be recorded and made available later on the event page on the Central Bank's website. This year, the Central Bank of Brazil had the partnership of the Credit Guarantee Fund, FGC, for the organization of this event, as well as the support of the following institutions: Associação Brasileira de Bancos, ABBC, Brazilian Bank Association, Associação Brasileira das Entidades dos Mercados Financeiro e de Capitais, ANBIMA, Brazilian Financial and Capital Markets Association, and ZETA, the Association of Technology Companies operating in the financial and payment methods sector. To give the opening speech, we invite the President of the Central Bank of Brazil, Roberto de Oliveira Campos Neto. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning to everyone. I was told to proceed this in English, so that's what I'm going to do. In Portuguese, so that's what I'm going to do. Eu queria agradecer a todos presentes.
I wanted to thank all of those that are here today, all of us that are watching us online, and I also wanted to thank our staff, those that made this event possible. I want to thank the Director for Economic Policies, Diogo, the Professor of Economy in Princeton, Gianluca Violante, our speakers, debaters, the professionals from the press. Good morning. It is a pleasure to begin the second annual conference of the Central Bank of Brazil that is being held as an important forum for exchange of knowledge, to divulge studies and have debates that are interesting in the area of operation of the central banks. I want to welcome all of you today to our institution. And before talking about our schedule today, I wanted to make a few comments about the macroeconomic environment. I'll talk about the recent events in the global and domestic economy, our situation, and also other relevant topics for central banks. Certainly, we'll debate those further during this event. Firstly, considering the world overview, the current scenario, macroeconomically speaking, is very different from that which we saw during the pandemic, due to important conjuncture changes. From a structural point of view, we saw several changes due to new technologies, changes in the labor market, and reorganization in the global production chains. This increases certainty in the macroeconomic overview. I will talk about a few of those changes. Currently, we have an external environment that is adverse due to high uncertainty that is persistent. Since the beginning of the flexibility of the economic policies in the United States, and we see a drop in inflation that is sustainable throughout the countries. The process of global inflation has moved forward and increased due to the prices of food and other products. We are in doubt on how those factors can impact the process of the inflation moving forward. Beyond that, we have a risk of a higher resilience in the inflation of services and the broad inflation as well, especially in the United States. Some factors that could have a deflationary effect did not have it. The reduce of the prices of commodities, the inflation from China, the drop in prices of rents, and the impacts on immigration, especially on the service providing sectors. We have high risks that are structural and conjectural for the moving forward with the process of the inflation globally. Within those risks, we can mention the expansion in geopolitics and their effects on the prices of energy and oil. Globally, these tensions have a potential of incentivizing cross-shoring and inner-shoring, bringing a greater fragmentation of global chains and an increase in the lack of efficiency in production and costs. It's important to highlight extreme weather events that are more current now and can generate high human impacts as well as effects throughout the productive chain. Floods that we've observed in Rio Grande do Sul are an example of those phenomena. I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to express my solidarity to the people from Rio Grande do Sul. Not only our civil servants, but as well as other people that are suffering from that tragedy. Lastly, it is also important to mention that global labor markets are currently presenting little or no untightening, which makes it hard to de-inflationate. The matter that we see is what are the factors which can contribute for the inflation to keep dropping. In the United States, it is difficult to answer that question, and this reinforces a scenario of being more difficult for the inflation to drop and for the monetary policy to be established. We have seen great changes in the and great uncertainty in the part of the monetary market in the United States, and for a broader scenario, there was always a repricing in the cycle of cuts of prices and in delaying the beginning. We reinforce that there is no mechanical relation between the conduction of the monetary American police and the determining of the basic Selic rate in Brazil. We are focused on the transition mechanisms of the external conjecture and the dynamic of inflation abroad. Another important point of concern for us is related to the fiscal policy, especially in advanced countries, which adds risks to the global economy. Because in an environment of higher interest rates, the cost of the debt service of advanced countries is absorbing more and more resources. This combination of fiscal and monetary policies takes away the liquidity of companies in low-income countries. The higher risk for those countries comes from the possibility that prolonged uncertainty will bring a repricing of assets. This uncertain scenario demands caution, especially from emerging economies. Even if those countries are more prepared to face external shocks, the impact of a more severe repricing worldwide could be significant. This scenario strengthens how important it is for us to take care of the monetary policy, as we could have more sudden movements in our scenario as a whole. Talking about vulnerability of emerging economies, it's important to reinforce macroeconomic topics as well as pay attention to the monetary policies adopted over the last few decades. Talking nationally, the indicators of economic activity are consistent with a scenario of resilience. In 2023, the Brazilian economy grew 2.9%, surpassing expectations. For 2024, the projections of the World Bank were revised from 1.7% to 1.9% in the last inflation report. The revision of IMF was even higher, from 1.7 to 2.2. Market analysts expect a 2.1 growth for 2024 and 2% in 2025. Over the last quarters, the economic data has surprised us with a greater growth in different components of demand. We highlight the resilience of domestic activity and the sustenance of consumption over time, contrasting with a scenario of gradual diminishing of pace that was previously predicted. We see a more strong activity with the progression of the year, and we have recurring surprises pointing to an elevated dynamic aspect in the labor market in a lot of dimensions. The combination of activities and a more strong labor market has taken us to reevaluate the asset prices. In relation to the behavior of inflation, we can see the maintenance of the trajectory of the inflation to have inflation to the consumer. The accumulated inflation has dropped from 12.1 to 3.7 in April 2024. Data reference to current inflation will show itself to be positive, not only in head inflation, but also in core inflation as well. We saw a weakening of the core inflation, even though this is in a level above average. There is also a concern of the inflation of food in short term, and as well as the role of service providing. The floods in Rio Grande do Sul, beyond humanitarian impacts, will have economic unfoldings that should be followed. There are also discussions due to the tightening in the labor market for salaries and prices, especially in the inflation of services, and it impacts in the trajectory of inflation. Preliminary evidence is in the intensive labor market has been persistently over the level required for us to fulfill the goal. We believe that the prospective scenario of the inflation will be the most challenging one, with the increase of the projections of inflation in the midterm, regardless of a higher interest taxes. And also there is an increase in the predictions that are shorter term with free and administered prices. The expectation for the market agents is still not anchored. The expectations for 2024, 2025, and 2026, which are presented by the Focus Company, we see in 3.8, 3.7, and 3.5 respectively. We also should highlight the fact that the expectations for 2024 and 2025, as well as implicit inflation, we have seen in those worsening in the last readings. The central bank has also been following the monetary policy and the impacts it has suffered. We believe that a fiscal policy that is feasible and compromised with the sustainability of that can help anchor the expectations for inflation and reduce risk premiums for financial assets, impacting the monetary policy as well. Even though the projections for the primary result and the debt trajectory has not been significantly altered, we've noticed in the recent period an increase in the risk premium and a perception of a worsened fiscal aspect, according to agents that have answered to a form. And the Committee for Monetary Policies has been talking about the possible and anchoring of policies related to inflation. We see a worsening in the external scenario in recent announcements relating to fiscal policy and the perception of economic agents in relation to the commitment of the monetary authorities in reaching the goal throughout the years. More relevantly, Copom unanimously notes that it should consider to uncouple the expectation of our inflation. In uncoupling the expectations of our inflation, we see this as an essential element to assure the convergence of inflation towards the goal. Copom believes that this requires a firm action of the monetary authorities, not only from institutions, but also from the monetary and fiscal framework that composes the Brazilian fiscal policies. Considering all of those factors, Copom unanimously considers that there is a need for a more contractionist monetary policy in order to reinforce the deflationary tendencies. The central bank reinforces that we will not stay away from our commitment to reaching the goal for the inflation, and we understand how important this is for us to understand the dynamics. Our mandate is clear, well-defined, and will be pursued. In summary, the current macroeconomic scenario is different from the one we observed before the pandemic, and we see new challenges. This conference brings us an opportunity to deepen the debates about topics that are related to recent developments in the global and domestic economy. The inflation to sustainability, from climate models to microfinance. With this event, we'll maintain our transition in dialoguing with academics and other central banks as well as multilateral organisms in order to build a policy that is based on the most recent and updated economic theory and recent empirical evidences. It will be an honor for us to have a keynote speech from Gianluca Violante from the Princeton University, from Javier Vives, from the business school IESE, and then we'll have also a session to commemorate the 10 years of the Real Plan with Gustavo Franco, Gustavo Loyola, Pedro Maran, and Perso Arida. In conclusion, on behalf of the Central Bank, I want to thank you all for being here, especially the speakers, the debaters, and moderators who said yes to our invitation, and they are a very necessary condition to the success of our event. I'm certain that we'll have a very productive conference with excellent discussions about subjects directed to the area of action of all central banks. I want to make an announcement in regards to our last decision of monetary policy to clarify a few points. I should say that in the previous announcement, we say that we had the conditions, and we discussed those in our meeting. The debate was about the level of conditions and not about the validity of the conditions of our arguments. On the external scenario, we look at the terminal tax and the risk of the scenario of the American taxes. We consider that there was a worsening in that sense, and we also discussed a strong labor market domestically and how this affected the inflation of services. We also discussed the risk that the food inflation could be less positive. Politics inflation was also considered, and this generates a change in oil prices. We saw that implicit and focuses were also worsening. This, after months, started a movement with a tendency for a increase. Our perspective was not anchored or coupled. The risk premium was also getting worse when we consider some important variables. For risk and risk premium, we had a clear perception of the feasibility of the fiscal framework with possible implications for the monetary policies. This was also very approached. The understanding that we had as a whole was clear that the changes were relevant and we should answer with an exchange in our pace. Within the group, some of us thought that we had arguments to change the risk balance. The debate was centered in technical criteria and all arguments were taken into consideration. We discussed the extreme relevance of expectations in the system for goals. We also discussed the importance of convergency of the inflation for the 3% goal. And we should not talk about center in the inflation theory as well. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much for your words, Mr. Governor. Now we'll begin the keynote speech of the day. We invite to the panel Joe Abriguilhem, Director of Economic Policy of the Central Bank of Brazil, and Mr. Gianluca Violante. He is a professor of economics at the Princeton University. His doctor in economy for the Pennsylvania University. Before teaching in Princeton, he was also a professor at the New York University and the University College London, UCL. His research interests range from macroeconomics, labor economy, and public finance. Professor Gianluca Violante received the Central Banking Award in 2019 in the category Economics in Central Banks for his work with monetary policy. We pass the floor on to Director Diogo to moderate the session. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Now we'll begin our keynote speech. You have the floor, Gianluca.
The slides of the professor, please. Could anybody upload them for him? Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. And I also want to thank the bank and Angelo in particular for the invitation to teach mini course on heterogeneity and monetary policy, which I did in the last couple of days with Felipe Alves, and it was great fun. It was an opportunity to meet the great research economists at the bank, and so I really enjoyed the opportunity. I'm going to talk about this paper that I wrote with a team at the ECB, at the European Central Bank, Gonzalo Gaspardo, Jirka Zlakalek, and Lorenzo Tristani, and with a student at University College London, Filippo Pallotti. And the title of the paper is Who Bears the Cost of Inflation? And we're going to try to answer this important question by looking at the experience of the Eurozone, some of the countries in the Eurozone. So this is it's a classic question in macroeconomics. The first thing to understand is that inflation is a tax. It's something that is very well understood, at least since Adam Smith. But what is less clear is how this tax redistributes across households. And as you know, Keynes and Friedman, they never met in person, obviously. But if they had met, they probably would not have agreed pretty much on anything. It's curious to notice that there is one thing on which they sort of view things in the same way, which is exactly inflation. So Keynes famously called inflation unjust in one of his books, and Friedman called it the cruelest tax of all. If you think about these two quotes, it seems like what these two great economists had in mind is that inflation is a regressive tax. So it's a tax that is mostly a burden for the low income, low wealth, more disadvantaged group of the population. This is sort of I think the common wisdom among many economists. But the reality is that it is very hard to measure all the effects of inflation across the income and wealth distribution because there are many, many channels through which inflation affects households. And there is a beautiful paper, an old paper, 1978, by Stan Fisher and Franco Modigliani, which is called Towards an Understanding of the Real Effects and Cost of Inflation, that goes through all the possible effects of anticipated and unanticipated inflation and concludes, very modestly, that the only perhaps surprising feature of this paper is the length of the list of the real effects of inflation. Okay? So these two great economists, they understood very well that this is a really complex matter to address. Stan Fisher later with Bill Easterly wrote a paper which is called Inflation and the Poor, where they concluded that this paper presents evidence that supports the view that inflation makes the poor worse off. But more recently, there is another really seminal paper in this literature by Dobke and Schneider, published in the JP in 2006, which is called Inflation and Redistribution of Nominal Wealth, which concludes that the main losers from inflation are the rich old households. Okay, so you can see that the profession is sort of still out there looking for answers, and I think it's fair to say that the question is still unsettled. The question about how the effects of inflation redistributes across the population. And I think one of the reasons, it's something important to keep in mind, is that inflation is an increase in the price level, the general price level, but it's something endogenous. At the root of increasing the price level, at the root of inflation, there are many possible shocks. There could be supply shocks, like the ones that we've seen with the disruption of supply chains in the last few years or so. Costs that increase, shocks that increase the cost of production. There could be demand shocks, for example, if there are loosening of financial conditions. There could be fiscal shocks if the government chooses to spend more. And each one of these types of shocks that can affect households differently across the distribution, right? So one possibility to try to understand more about this question is to simply analyze these shocks one at a time. The difficulty with this approach, we think, is that every episode is a mix of these shocks at the same time. Think about the pandemic. The pandemic was a mix, clearly, of supply and demand shocks. And so it's very hard to identify and separate these effects. So another approach, which is the one that we take, is that of looking at a particular event, okay? So it's like, if you like, you can think of this as being an event study. And we're going to focus on the recent inflation episode in the euro area. Okay? We do it in the euro area because we have good data and because my co-authors work at the ECB, so they're interested in the euro area. This is a plot of the price index, the equivalent of the CPI, for the euro area from 2020, quarter 1 2020 to quarter 4 2023. What you can see is an increase in the general price level of about 17% in the 2 years 2021 and 2022. Okay, so it's a large increase, and especially historical is a large increase for the eurozone, which in the 10 years in the decade before 2020 had essentially almost zero inflation. So inflation below target for a long period of time. Okay? And you see that after, towards the end of 2023, the price level starts again flattening out and growing a little bit at the rate of, say, target inflation on maybe 2% or so, a little bit more. Right? So this is the episode that we want to study. Okay? So we're not going to go in the direction of trying to understand the roots, but we're just taking, this is the shock, and think about maybe a combination of shock that leads to this increase in the price level, this inflation episode, and trying to understand what are the consequences for households. Okay, so as I said, 17% cumulative increase in prices. The key drivers, as you probably know, are a big increase in the energy price, associated mostly to the war in Ukraine, and food prices. But as you will see, there was really a generalized increase in the price level across all goods. Now, if you read the public debate over the last 2 years, again, try to understand, whether this inflation was mostly a cost for the poor or for the rich, for the young or for the old. You see a lot of contrasting arguments, exactly as in the literature that I just described, right? I mean, some read the newspaper, some will say that the poorer, younger households spend more on energy and food, so are the ones that are hit the most. But at the same time, the wealthier and older households own more nominal wealth, and so obviously they're the ones that lose the most from inflation through a devaluation of nominal wealth. Okay, so we want to try to understand more about this. Our contribution is going to be conceptual, so organize a framework to illustrate the transmission channels of the inflation shock across the distribution through many channels, the ones that we think are quantitatively relevant. And empirically, we quantify the size of the various channels across the households in the 4 main euro area countries. So we're going to do France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. Okay? And we're going to think about heterogeneity in terms of 2 dimensions. Income, so we're going to look at low income, high income, poor and rich, and age, young and old. So we're going to think about these 2-dimensional heterogeneity. Okay? So I'm going to talk for the next 10 minutes or so about the framework. So there are going to be some equations here. We're going to try to explain very clearly what these equations mean. So for those of you who are not too well versed in math, and I'll try to explain what each of these equations mean. Don't get scared, but I wouldn't want to be in the shoes of the translator for the next 10 minutes. Sorry. All right. So here's the thought experiment, okay? So we're going to think, basically, about, say, 3 periods. I'm going to call -1, 0, and 1, okay? T-1 is the steady state, is the initial period at which the price level is constant. Okay, I'm going to assume it's constant, but you can assume it's like on trend inflation, say 2%. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to assume it's constant for simplicity. Then at t equals 0, so the first period at t equals 0, which I'm going to call the short run, that's when the shock hits. Okay, so I'm going to think of this period as being 2021 and 2022, which is where most of the increase, as I showed in the data, of the price level took place. And I will think of this as an unanticipated inflation shock. Okay, so this is very important. That has to be unanticipated, and I think it was. It was really an unexpected shock. Okay, which is a permanent jump in the price level of, say, 17%. Okay, roughly. It's gonna vary country by country. I'm gonna call is this working? I'm gonna call this shock, just for some notation later, DZ0. Z as the shock, 0 is the period which it occurs. Then I'm going to assume that at period t equal 1, which I'm going to call the long run, okay, so post 2022, price stability is restored. Okay, and you saw in the plot that prices tend to flatten out, so it seems like a good assumption. All right, now inflation is an increase in the price level, but every inflation episode comes with a change in relative prices, and we have seen. Also for the European episode, a large change in the relative price. Okay, in particular, food and energy increase more than other prices. So we're going to allow relative prices being unrestricted in the first period. Okay, so in particular, there will be some dispersion of prices in the period. Imagine that, for example, here P2 is energy, okay, and P1 is, say, rents, which didn't change very much over this period. But then we're going to assume that after post-2022, the relative prices get realigned. Okay, so the ratio of P2 and P1 is the same post-2022 that before 2021, before the shock. Okay, so we're going to assume a realignment of relative prices. Now, if you look at the data, this is not quite happening yet. There is some realignment, but it's not full. But we're going to work with this assumption. Okay. Then the other assumption we're going to make, so these are assumptions when A1 and A2. Assumption A3 is that the shock is neutral in the long run, meaning that all values of the real values of wages, asset prices, taxes, dividends, and so on, they're going to catch up fully with the price level. Okay, so it's going to take some time. This is happening, still in process, but it's going to take some time. And they're going to catch up. So after basically period 2, in the long run, which is the common assumption that we make in economics, in the long run, monetary policy has no effects, okay, or inflation shocks have no effect, same thing. Okay, we're also going to make an assumption about the government budget constraint. The inflation shock has some impact on the government budget constraint. It's going to change resources, and we're going to assume that the government changes future real surpluses after t greater than 1, okay? Which means that basically the increase in taxes or say decrease in taxes that are going to happen because of this shock will not affect the current generation but the future generations. This is something that can be changed. All right. Okay. So effectively, for those of you who know this class of models, we're going to work with an overlapping generations of 2 periods, 0, 1, the short run and long run. And this is what the problem of a court born at time equals 0 looks like. Okay, V is the value of an individual, so discounted utility of period 0 and period 1, subject to a budget constraint. Okay, this budget constraint is kind of key because things are going to happen in this budget constraint. So let me explain what these objects are. So C is consumption, okay? P is the price level, okay? So P is what changes, is the price level. Notice that I allowed P to be indexed by I. What does it mean? It means that I'm going to allow essentially individuals to be heterogeneous in the consumption baskets that they consume, and therefore in the price level that they face, right? For example, poor people consume more out of their budget of energy and food, and so their price level that refers to the consumption basket is different from the price level of the rich people. W is wages, T is taxes, and then I'm going to have this B, BS and BL, which are short-term bonds and long-term bonds. Okay? These are going to be nominal bonds. Q are the prices of these bonds, and the AK are the real assets. So think of AK as being basically stocks and housing. Okay? Stocks and housing. And then on the second row, you have basically the purchases of, on the first row, you have basically the position, the nominal positions of the household, and on the nominal and real position of the household, and in the second row, you have the purchases for the next period of bonds and assets. Okay? So that's kind of that's the problem that we're going to work with. Now, another thing that is important is to notice that actually governments over this period in Europe, they did a lot. They did a lot in terms of trying to contain the inflation shock, okay? And in doing that, they affected prices. So I have denoted by P star and P two different prices. P is the effective prices that households have faced, okay? P star is the price before the government interventions. And I'm going to call T, this script T, a sort of price subsidy, implicit price subsidy, that, for example, are interventions in energy markets that occurred in many countries that reduce the effective prices that households faced. Okay? All right. Now, what am I going to do with this framework? We want to understand what is the impact of the inflation shock on each household welfare, okay? And each of these groups that are defined by income and age. In terms of the methodology, we're going to use the envelope theorem, which is a kind of first-order perturbation of this budget constraint, essentially. One assumption that I want to mention that is important is that this methodology is very simple and it's very clean, we think, but has one shortcoming. The shortcoming is that we're not going to be able to measure how households have adapted to these changing prices, okay? Meaning that, for example, because energy price went up, households might have consumed a little bit less energy, okay? And this is something that does not show up in our calculations. It's also something that we don't observe with the data that we have. We're going to observe now that the data for maybe 2023, 2024 are available, but so something we can incorporate later. Also, I'm going to express gains and losses for households in terms of what is called the money metric, welfare change, basically dollars, euros here, okay? Euros, 2019 euros, okay? And I'm going to express them in terms of as a share of income. Okay, so I'm going to say 4% is going to be 4% of income. So to give you a sense of the magnitude. Think about what the model incorporates in terms of sources of heterogeneity in welfare change. We're going to have heterogeneous consumption baskets. So households are going to be basically allowed to consume different baskets across them. They're going to have heterogeneous nominal positions. Some are borrowers, some are savers. Okay, we're going to incorporate that. Potentially, because they work in different sectors, different occupations, we're going to allow for the wage stickiness, the nominal wages to adjust at different rates, respond different rates to inflation. Okay? We're going to have retirees or pensioners here, and pensions in some countries are indexed to inflation, in other countries are not indexed to inflation. And then we have allowed for heterogeneous holdings of real assets, so housing and stocks, whose price is allowed to vary responding to inflation. Okay? So all these channels, you see already how complicated sort of the channels are and how they can go in different directions. And this is sort of what we're going to find in the end. All right. So in the end, we're going to decompose welfare into 4 components, and we're going to try to measure each one of these components. The first one, I'm going to call it direct component. This is the impact of the raw inflation shock on nominal income and wealth. Okay, this is just, the general price level increasing and reducing purchasing power of households. The second, I'm going to call it unconventional fiscal policy, and it's related to all these fiscal measures the government took in order to reduce the impact of inflation on households. And it's going to be the difference between the raw price before government intervention and the price that households faced. The third set of effects, I'm going to call them indirect or equilibrium effects, and those incorporate essentially the response of wages, dividends, taxes, asset prices to the shock. Okay, that also affect households. And finally, there is one last component. This is a bit, it's kind of less important, but it's the residual component that takes place because of the relative price realignment. Remember that I assumed that after 2023, the relative prices, after, say, widening, they sort of converge back again. So you have to also to take that adjustment into account, but that's not that important. Okay. Now, for the next 3 slides, I have a way to analyze these 4 components at a time. And again, this expression can be a little bit scary, maybe. I'll try to explain. Okay. So this is the direct component. So what is the direct component? So on the first row, you have basically the change in the price level, change in the raw price, okay, before government intervention. That I'm going to split between the average price and the difference between the individual price that each individual faces because of the different consumption basket and the average price, okay? And how that affects the real value of nominal income, the net nominal positions of households, okay, so like nominal debt or nominal assets, and dividends and capital gains. Right? So this is basically, we're going to use these formulas to then go to the data and measure each one of these components. So that's the direct effect, the direct impact of the shock. The second impact of the shock is and the second component is the unconventional fiscal policy component. This is basically the same component as before, but what you have here is the difference between the raw price and the price faced by agents. Okay, so this is basically how much the government, through fiscal intervention, has reduced the effective inflation faced by households. Okay, times the same term as before. And on top of that, I'm going to add what we called ad hoc transfers, because countries, as I will explain later, they reacted differently to this inflation shock. In some countries, government said, okay, let's try to, say, control energy prices. Okay? In other countries, they said, well, no, let's market work, without any intervention, any distortion, but let's support households directly by transferring some resources to them so that they can pay the electricity bill with the money that comes from the government. Okay, so different ways of thinking about cushioning the shock on households. Some countries cut the VAT, and we do take that into account in these calculations. Yes, I'm going to talk about this when I talk about how we do this. I mean, you can think of you can think of VAT exactly like in this way, with the positive signs and negative sign. Very good, excellent. So that's the second component. The third component is this indirect component, where we allow all the prices that enter the government budget constraint to change because of the shock. Okay, so the idea is the following. The idea is that there is the shock, and maybe firms and workers get together and they negotiate an increase in nominal wages that catch up partially to the shock. Okay, that's one thing. On the asset price of things, there has been an inflation shock, and traders in asset markets react. Buyers and sellers, they react in a certain way, and that leads to maybe an increase or a decrease in prices. Okay, so house prices can change, stock prices can change, and we let them change freely, and just we go to the data and measure what happens. The other thing that okay, so basically you have these effects both because of equilibrium forces and because of indexation, just indexation, pure indexation, or because of, bargaining that leads to a change in prices. The other thing that is very important that happens is that taxes, you see net taxes that households face, they also change. In fact, they're going to go up through this effect that is called fiscal drag of bracket creep, okay? Which means the following. If you keep the tax brackets constant, okay, but in nominal terms, income goes up, then you're climbing the tax brackets and going to end up paying more taxes if the system is progressive, as in many of these countries. And it turns out that actually this was an unexpected source of revenues for many of the governments in the euro area, but also an additional cost for households, clearly. Okay. The last component is this long-run component, which is just, as I explained, a realignment or relative prices. Okay, this is just something residual that comes from the fact that in the long run we assume that the relative prices realign, and this is something that, again, we were kind of surprised. We looked at the most recent data. It doesn't seem to be happening yet, and so in some, maybe in the future version we're going to just shut down this channel because it doesn't seem to be there yet. Okay, that's it. No more math. Okay. So these are the 4 components. Now I'm going to go to the data and try to measure these 4 components. So as I said, we're going to focus on the 4 big economies in the euro area. Okay, so France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, and we're going to divide demographic groups into 3 age groups: 25-44, which I'm going to call the young, 45-64, middle age, and 65 plus, which I'm going to call the retirees, all the elderly or old. And we're going to group people into 5 consumption expenditure quintiles, which are a proxy for permanent income. Okay, so proxy for income, permanent income. Okay, so we're going to have, like, low income young, high income young, low income old, high income young, and so on, all the combinations, 15 groups. We have very good data, obviously, on prices, which are going to aggregate into 20 categories. Okay, so we're going to allow households to spend different shares of their budget on these 20 categories. And these data come from the household budget survey, which is a data set on spending, household spending in the euro area. We have very detailed data on good and service level prices, which come from the official price index, the data that underline the official price index in the euro area, which is called the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices. Now, the whole exercise is about measuring surprise inflation. Okay, we think this was a surprise inflation, and it really matters a lot whether inflation is anticipated or unanticipated in these models and in economics in general for monetary policy, as you all know. But we think of this as a surprise inflation episode. Okay, so we think of this as deviations from expected inflation, which, roughly 2%, which is the target. All right. So I'm going to start with some plots. This is, okay, what I'm plotting here is basically cumulative household level inflation for the 4 countries and for each of these 15 groups. Okay, so you have the country, so you're gonna see a whole lot of graphs like this, so let me explain. You have the countries, then you have young, middle age, and old, and within this group you have 5 bars which correspond to the 5 quintiles of income. All right, so you see quite a bit of heterogeneity here, right? I mean, inflation goes from perhaps the lowest level, which is the low income young in France, which is about 10%. This is cumulative inflation, okay, over 21 and 22. And the low income old in Italy faced an inflation rate of like 33%. Okay, that's a big number. That's a big number. The average cumulative change in the price level is about 11% in France and Spain, 16% in Germany, 20% in Italy over this period. So big increase in the price level. Now, you see that there's not a clear slope. There is somewhat of a slope with respect to age. It seems like the old this is increasing in age. It seems that the older facing higher inflation, but within income doesn't seem to be a very clear slope, for example. Okay. All right. What are the sources of inflation across the distribution? We split the change in the price between like food, energy, rent, and other. You see that a big component everywhere was energy. Energy was the biggest component. Food was significant component, especially in Spain, was a significant component of the increase. But you see the orange bar, which is everything else, that's also significant in pretty much everywhere, okay? Except perhaps in Italy, which is dominated by energy. So it was really like a generalized increase in the price level. And if you think about, the supply chain disruptions, that increased prices of all goods, durable goods and so on. So it's not that surprising. But energy was obviously a big component. All right. So how do we measure this kind of fiscal support interventions, which we call unconventional fiscal policy? Well, there is a data set that has been put together by the European Union. It's called the Bruegel data set on national fiscal policy responses to the energy crisis. And many economists have done a lot of work, and we just, over the years, and we just basically borrow what they do. We split interventions into two groups. The first are sort of energy market interventions. These are the two main type of interventions. There are others like the changing VAT. But energy market intervention, which includes both subsidies and outright regulation, okay? And then we try to calculate counterfactual price indices, okay? This is obviously, it's a big task. There's a lot of assumptions, but we think that up to first order, we do it right. And then we also take into account, as I said, direct transfers, right? The fact that government transfer directly, especially in Italy. In Italy, for example, Italy did not really intervene much on the energy market, but they chose to transfer to households in order to support low-income households, increase expenditures on energy. Now, this is a plot of that quantifies the role of unconventional fiscal policy in containing inflation in these countries. The blue bars is the actual inflation, so the inflation that households faced effectively. And the light blue is the difference to counterfactual inflation. So if the governments had done nothing, inflation would have been higher by the light blue component of the bar. This is about 2%, pretty much everywhere, okay, 2 percentage points over the 21-22. So 2% out of, we said about 16 on average, right? So, not huge, but not negligible. But it was actually 5%, close to 5% in Spain. So in Spain did a lot. They did a lot to contain the cost of inflation for households. Obviously, they did that by spending, right? So there's no free lunch here, and I'll come back on this later. All right, continuing on the measurement, obviously a key component here is to have data on the cross-sectional households, on nominal income, and all assets and liabilities, basically on the portfolio position of households, right? And we're lucky that we have this survey, which is called the Household Finance and Consumption Survey for the Euro area, where we have very detailed information about all the assets, stocks and bonds and deposits and housing and liabilities. So all kind of debt, mortgage debt, and other type of debt, right? For wages, we have official data on negotiated wage agreements and minimum wages. House prices, stock prices, and long prices. How do we understand? How do we try to measure the effect of the shock on asset prices? Well, we do something which is a bit courageous, but we have to do something about this. And what we do is basically we try to estimate what is the reaction of basically, say, for stock prices on the day in which the German price index news are released. Okay, so it's a sort of high-frequency identification type of assumption. All right, we find in general these effects are measured with a lot of noise. Unfortunately, we don't have very significant estimates here, but we find sizable effects on stock prices, negative. Okay, which is not a surprise, right? Because if you have an inflation shock, then what you expect is that central bank is going to increase interest rates, and the stock market doesn't like when rates go up. Okay, so let me start with measuring some of these components. So I'm gonna basically talk about Spain and Germany mostly because they're very different, and I'm gonna compare. So here's the direct component that I talked about for Spain. So the blue bar is net income, and you see a loss of about 7%. This is over these 2 years, okay? 7% of income over these 2 years. 7% of income, okay? The effect on nominal net position, as you can see, this is the light blue bar, is very different and very heterogeneous across the distribution, okay? You have negative effects for the old and positive effect for the young. Why is this the case? Well, because with the young, remember, 25 to 44, okay, so not that young. So there are some, sorry. But, this group includes a lot of mortgages. There's a lot of mortgage debt in Spain. There's a lot of mortgage debt, fixed rate mortgages as well. And so all mortgagers, they gain. And they gain large amounts here. You see that they gain up to sort of 10%, 10-15% as a fraction of their income. The retirees, they lose because they have their wealth in deposits, mostly, okay? Bank deposits, which get devaluated through inflation. And they have losses, as you can see here, they have losses up to 20%. Up to 20%, 15, 20%, okay? The third component, which is the yellow component, is the difference between, the individual inflation rate that households face because of the different consumption baskets and the average inflation rate. So if this number is negative, it means that this group of households face higher inflation than the average, right? Because of the composition of the consumption bundle. And you see for retirees, for example, that this number is pretty large and negative because they consume a larger share of their income in food and energy, okay? And this is especially true for the low-income retirees. The last component is the capital gains component. This comes from the fact that, if you say you sell a nominal asset, okay, you're going to realize a nominal gain, but this nominal gain with inflation becomes smaller. Okay, so sellers tend to lose and buyers tend to gain, and this is what you see. You see that the retirees tend to be sellers of these assets, and they tend to lose. And actually, this is the orange part of the bar. It's not that big, but overall, this component tells us that the old lose about 20% of their income, and the young gain 5% of their income. Okay, so you see already a big difference across generation between young and old. Compare Spain on the right-hand side with Germany on the left-hand side. The most notable difference here is that there is a lot more heterogeneity in these gains and losses across the distribution for Spain than for Germany. And the reason that Germans don't have a lot of debt. They just don't have a lot of debt. There are many fewer homeowners, as you probably know, in Germany. Germans tend to rent as opposed to buy. And because they don't buy, they don't have mortgage debt. And because they don't have mortgage debt, they don't realize gains when inflation goes up. Okay? And that's the biggest difference between Germany and Spain. So these are the 4 countries together, okay? Spain and Germany, which you have seen, and also France and Italy. France and Italy look sort of somewhere in between these two. France looks a little bit more like Spain because in France there is, again, a lot of mortgage debt. In Italy there are many homeowners. But there's not a lot of mortgage debt because the kids tend to inherit the house from their parents. And so they just they get the house without having to take up a mortgage. Okay. The thing that I want to also highlight here is that you see there's not a clear slope or gradient with respect to income. There is with respect to age, but there's not with respect to income, okay? Which is something that we'll also keep seeing. Okay, so here's the unconventional fiscal policy, the unconventional fiscal policy component. So here you see I'm going to put it together with the direct effect. The direct effect, which I just explained before, is the blue bars. The sum of the yellow and the light blue is the unconventional fiscal policy. So all these numbers, for at least for those with positive nominal net positions, are positive, right? And you see they're kind of significant. Okay, so for example, for the low-income retirees in Spain, the unconventional fiscal policies reduced the loss by 10%. Okay, so intervention in the energy market were actually significant to reduce these losses. So this is a non-trivial, is a really a non-trivial component of the calculations. The indirect component, okay, all this general equilibrium adjustment that you've seen, I added it here. This is the yellow bar. Compared to direct and the unconventional one, is pretty small. It's pretty small. Okay, so not a lot of adjustments in terms of asset prices, at least over these 2 years. Not a lot of reaction on these asset prices. Nothing really big happened. If you look, so this yellow component is small, right? But if you look at within the component, the component that changed the most is pensions for the retirees. Okay, because pensions are indexed in many of these countries. Okay, so pensions adjust. They didn't adjust all the way, but they adjusted much more than nominal income. The other component that is adjusted is minimum wages. Minimum wages tend to be indexed to inflation, and so they also grew, as you can see, in Germany and France. This is the light blue component. Minimum wages increased, and that tended to protect the low-income households. Okay, so this is a component that actually contributed to cushioning the shock for low-income households. Then there is the long-run component. I'm just going to skip it because it's actually pretty small everywhere. So this is the relative price adjustment. So putting everything together, right? Okay, so there's been we lay out this framework. Using the framework, we try to measure all these components, and now we're putting everything together, putting the 4 components together. The direct effect is the blue one, unconventional fiscal policy light blue. The yellow is the indirect effect, and the orange is the long run. You see that most of the gains and losses, they come from the direct effect, in particular from the nominal net position. But as I said, the fiscal response is sizable. Overall, how big are these effects? Well, on average, Germans lost 4% of their income for the 2 years, okay, in 21 and 22. In France, 2.8, in Spain, 3, so between 3 and 4, but in Italy, the number was much, much bigger, 8%. It was really like a very big loss, a very big number. Because one of the reasons is that, we said very little was done by governments, but also the shock itself was bigger. Remember, the inflation shock was bigger, was much bigger in Italy than in other countries. In terms of the heterogeneity, okay, if you look at so we started setting up the question, asking, well, who's going to lose from inflation? Is it the poor? Is the rich? Is the young? Is the old? Well, here we have some answers, right? I mean, it definitely seems that there is a slope overall with respect to age. So inflation in the euro area for these episodes looks like an age-dependent tax. That's what it looks like. It looks like an age-dependent tax, which is, it's increasing in age. So it's paid by the retirees, mostly. It looks like, in some of these countries, it looks like a redistribution from the retirees, from the old to the young. But there's no clear pattern across quintiles within age, okay? So, in between, like, Easterly, and remember the Easterly Fisher versus Topken-Schneider, we tend to be with Topken-Schneider here. We find much stronger gradient with respect to age than income. But there is a lot of heterogeneity, you see? I mean, losses are as large as 15% for the retirees in Italy and gains are large at 5% for the young in Spain. There are also, you can also ask, okay, how many households are winners from inflation, which would be surprising, right? I mean, you think of inflation as a tax, as a cost for everyone, but there are winners. And on average, 30% of households, they win from inflation, actually. Inflation is a good thing for them. Maybe surprising, but that's what it is. And for example, in Germany, France, and Spain, half of the young are winners. Where the loser are the retirees, obviously. Among the retirees, almost everybody is a loser. Yes? That's true. That's true. That's why we're distinguishing between income and age, because we think it's important to make the point that, if you see this gradient by wealth, it is age, it's not wealth within age. It is correlated, yes. But here, if you condition on age, there's no gradient with respect to condition on age, there's no gradient with respect to wealth. Absolutely. Okay. So in my last 5 minutes, I wanna go beyond the household sector, right? Because we documented significant losses for the household sector, especially through the nominal net positions. But the question is, who's on the other side? Who's on the other side of this nominal net position? Okay, we have to think general equilibrium here. And the other side, well, there is obviously foreigners, the foreign sector, and the government, but it's mostly the government. So the government in all these countries is going to gain from inflation because it's a net borrower. But it also loses. It also loses through these ad hoc fiscal measures that we talked about, because they are additional expenditures, and the higher cost of its purchases. The government also is a consumer of goods, right? The government buys goods, and these goods have higher price now, and so the government loses. So here's in this table, I try to summarize the findings. So the first column is the net gain from household, which are losses across all these countries. These are the numbers that I just reported and explained. The other 4 columns are the implication for the government, okay? So the government has big gains through the net nominal position channel because the government borrows, right? So these losses are about 4%, these gains, I'm sorry, are 4% in all countries, but are actually 14% in Italy. Why? Because Italy had a bigger inflation and because it has a higher debt to GDP ratio. Okay? These gains are expressed in terms of GDP. The government has losses through the fiscal support, okay, because of these measures that I just talked about, the second column, and because of the higher cost. Okay? Notice that these costs are not very large, because a lot of the government costs, for example, are wages to the government employees, and these are very sticky nominally, okay, through collective bargaining and so on. It takes a while for, at least in these countries, for those to be negotiated upward. But overall, the last column tells you that the government has been a net gain, a net winner. And what is interesting, from my perspective, is to look at the comparison between the net gain of the government and the net loss of households. Okay? Because you can ask the question, well, given these gains, could the government fully compensate households by, at some point in the future, reducing taxes maybe, or increasing transfers to compensate for the welfare loss of the inflation over these 2 years? And you see that in almost every country they could potentially, except for France. In France, the net gains are very small relative to the losses. Okay, and this takes me to my last slide, where let me summarize what we did in this paper. So we concluded that the inflation shock was an age-dependent tax that hit hard older households. Within age, across income, and there is uniform incidence. So there is a compensation of 2 effects: higher inflation rate for the poor, but larger nominal net position for the rich, which means larger losses for the rich. Italy was the country that recorded the largest welfare loss. Spain has the largest share of winners because of the mortgage debt. And conventional fiscal policy kind of seemed to work and was significant. Housing and stocks, they don't seem to be good inflation hedges in the short run for households. Nominal wages are quite rigid, they didn't adjust much. And governments were net winners, and except for France, in all the other countries, they could potentially in the future, if they wanted to, I don't think it's going to happen, but if they wanted to, compensate the household sector for these losses. And that's all I had to say. Thank you very much.
Open for a couple of questions. May I start with one and then we do, say, one or two or three, and then in the coffee break you can answer more. So, I guess some of the conclusions were that inflation is age-dependent tax, that direct component matters a lot. If you were to, it's speculative, but if you were to translate to an EM, how would you see, like, what would you expect thinking about the dimensions, or if you were to, or if you would have to add dimensions? Thinking about an EM country, for instance, do you think that these conclusions would hold, or you would have to change the dimensions, for instance, on, the assets that you put, the real equity? So thinking a little bit of taking the engine and trying to put it in another country, what holds and what doesn't. That would be my, and I know I'm not asking about the paper, so it's always speculative, but that would be the first. Let me open, and then we get all the questions.
Good morning. Tony Ricardo, Banco Central do Brasil, here. A question is, I don't know, it's silly, but here in Brazil, the retirees spend a lot in drugstore. But there, in your model, these countries, we see food and energy as the main component. In these countries, the older people don't spend a lot in drugstores, or don't have, or how is the government helping them?
Hi, great talk, and very interesting for Spain, obviously. I am from Spain. My question is, if I understand correctly your results, all these interventions in the aggregate for total welfare are good, no? So the total welfare increases. But this, if I understand correctly also, is a kind of short-term analysis. That's to say, all these distortionary measures that have been introduced, what effects may have more in the medium term, etc.? I think from experience we know that if you control prices, you may repress inflation in the short term and you increase it in the medium term. So I don't know what's your conjecture on that.
All right, maybe I'm going to start from this last question. Okay, so yeah, we do know that when you start messing up with markets, then you tend to have sort of long-term consequences and maybe unexpected and undesired consequences. So this is a little bit, a little bit beyond the scope of the paper. We do have, the analysis takes into account the long run as well. In order to do that, we have to make some assumptions, obviously, because we don't see it. Okay, so we make, for example, this assumption that the relative prices are going to converge back to the initial level. Okay, so here's one assumption that we're making where you may disagree. You may say, well, because of these interventions, there may be like a bounce back of prices which were kept artificially low. And so instead of going back to the, say, the initial level, they're gonna be some sort of overshooting. For that, you really need a model, like a structural model where you think about how firms price and how they think about the future and so on. One component that we do have about the long run is just
pure accounting, the fact that these price control measures were sort of, they came hand in hand with the transfers to these firms, obviously, and these transfers to these firms were costly, and these costs show up in the government budget constraint. So at least that part is accounted for. But otherwise, I completely agree with you. And I think this is, the way I think about this paper is really like using simple theory to develop an accounting framework. But, you know, because of it's an accounting framework, we have to take some shortcuts, and we don't really microfound everything. Yeah. All right. Let me go backwards. So with respect to the question on drugstores and food, well, food was food prices went up, actually, especially in Spain, so kind of surprising, much more than in other countries. I mean, I think that there was a lot of focus from the government side on energy prices, because that was the most visible to households, that is the most salient item, whose price increased a lot. And so a lot of those interventions were concentrated there. But as I said, in some countries, in Italy in particular, Italy, you know, the government took the view, which I think is a bit populistic, honestly, but they took the view that they wanted to deal with this by transferring. It's more visible. It's kind of more visible if you just, you know, send checks to households. And so in that sense, you know, that is one advantage of that, in a way, is that households can choose how to spend. So some households might have decided to maybe spend more on food, or try to compensate the increase in the food prices through additional transfers. Now, the question about how to adapt this framework to other countries, I think it's really, I mean, it's something we're very interested in. We're now trying to apply this framework to the US experience, which is different because the US didn't have a big increase in energy prices, much smaller compared to Europe, but a lot of the inflation came precisely because of the fiscal spending. I mean, at least that's kind of my view. I mean, there was obviously a supply channel, you know, the supply chain disruption that contributed a lot. There's a big change in relative prices of goods and services, big change in relative prices. But also the government, you know, implemented one of the biggest historically, fiscal relief packages, biggest at the Marshall Plan, you know, in sheer size. And so that would be something to take into account, for example, on the US side. For Latin American countries, we were talking about this with the economists at the bank the other day. I think a really important component to incorporate would be the informal sector, and try to think how inflation affects the informal sector. And here, I'm not an expert. I would love to hear what you think. You know much more than I do. It would be interesting to think, when you have this type of shocks, say demand shocks, what happens to the relative price of the goods produced in the formal versus informal sector? What happens to the wages, to the salaries paid in the formal versus informal sector? I have this sense that perhaps wages in the informal sector are more flexible than the formal sector, where wages are often negotiated, and it takes time for wages to be renegotiated. So everything happens with a delay, maybe in the formal sector. But on the other hand, if you have minimum wages which are indexed to inflation, then you have immediately big changes in wages of the low income distribution on the formal sector, and that actually can lead to people to shift out of the informal sector to the formal sector if the wage at the bottom kind of catches up with inflation while the others don't. So I think it's complicated, but definitely I would say I would try to incorporate the informal sector into the analysis more explicitly.
Thank you so much. We have now a 15-minute coffee break with, feel free to reach out and ask him during the coffee break.
Yeah, please, if you have questions.
Agradecemos ao diretor Diogo Guilhem.
Thank you very much,
diretor de política
Director
econômica.
Diogo Guilhem. He is the Economic Director of the Central Bank of Brazil. And thank you to Professor Gianluca. Right after the coffee break, the academic sessions of macroeconomics, they're going to take place inside the Saudi.
Microeconomia acontecerão no auditório ao lado. A sessão de abertura e a palestra magna realizadas hoje foram transmitidas ao vivo pelo Banco Central do Brasil e permanecerão disponíveis para acesso público no YouTube. As sessões acadêmicas que se seguirão, realizadas com a parceria do FGC.
Jointly with the FGC and with the support of Febraban, they're going to be recorded and made available on the event's website on the internet. Okay, thank you very much.